In today's video I'm going to show you how to achieve a natural looking relic on your guitar or bass's headstock. The key thing to doing any sort of relic like this is source material. So here on my phone I've got a series of photos which I'm working from. That ensures that I'm not making up what the relic looks like, but referring to actual relic, and I can find the ones I like. I'm going in first with my card scraper here, or cabinet scraper you might call it, just on the sort of hard angles of the edge of the headstock and the volute here to reveal the wood underneath. And what's cool about using this tool, along with my wood carving knife here, is they're both quite thick really, not like a scalpel blade, and it means only are they revealing the wood, but they're causing chips in the finish as well, and I think those chips look great. That's why in lots of areas I like to start with the chipping element. Here again, looking at the source material, and I'm going in, and you'll notice the wood that I'm revealing is actually quite light because it hasn't been exposed previously and therefore got dirty, but don't worry about that. We're going to sort that out later on in this video. There are certain areas which naturally seem to relic because they get dents and dings as you bash it round, so corners like this and edges are absolutely fantastic to do it on, and again with this knife it makes it really easy. I used to use a scalpel to do this and it works as well, but because it's sharper I'm more likely to cut my finger. So here's just an overview of how it's looking at the moment. Again, quite clean. Now what you'll find with a lot of relics is some of those chips are there and really visible, but often the varnish has worn thin through use, rubbing against your hands, etc. So then I'm going in with some sandpaper to really smooth that transition in some areas from the chips to the wood underneath. And I normally, when I do this, start with something like 400 grit paper, sometimes 600, and then work my way up a bit to smooth it out so there's not so many scratches that are obvious in the finish. And then I might go in and add a few chips back into it. Personally, I think this attention to detail of getting a mix of chip and worn is what makes the relics more realistic and much more successful. And by the way, there's different ways to relic guitars, and I often use other processes as an alternative to this. So do check out in the video description a link to my playlist of relic techniques, because there may be a different one that you prefer to use. You don't really know until you've seen them all and tried them all. So you can see here again, I'm going over that bit that I chipped off originally on that corner to smooth some of it in, and some of it, because the thickness of the finish that was already on this guitar, some of it will already look like chips and some of it will fade much better. Here's a close-up of that. You can see a chip, you can see the fade, and I'm just sort of going back in to create a bit more of the varnish to really kind of crumble off or pop off. Sometimes I like seeing the thickness of the varnish on the edge of the chip, and you don't really get that once you've gone over it with the sandpaper. And then to dirty up that kind of exposed bare wood, I often use watered down acrylic that I've got the colour I really want on it and just sort of paint over the top literally, let it seep in. Occasionally I'll use a wood stain that I've watered down as well. But either way, I like to put it on and wipe it off quickly so that it doesn't really stain the varnish or anything around the edge. And what you often find is where the wood is more exposed, where you've sanded through or scraped through not just the varnish but the sealer underneath, then the acrylic or the wood stain that you use really seeps in. And I highly recommend you start more watered down and do it in layers and work it up so you don't go over the top straight away. And if there's any areas on your guitar or bass that might be covered up, say for example under a pick guard or even inside one of the pickup recesses, that's a good place to test out your colour, just to check it's what you really want once it touches that exposed wood. Now on the top here I'm just going over the edge with sandpaper because at the moment you've got a nice straight edge where the black and white and then the wood finish sort of meet, and what I really want is for that to look a bit more worn, not quite as perfect. So the sandpaper works really well for this. Again, I start with the sort of heavier grades and I work up. I might end up going over it with something like 1,000 to sort of get rid of any scratches, and sometimes even go in with a bit of compound polish to polish it off, just to make sure some of those scratches aren't visible. But if you get the angle just right when you're sanding like this, you're not really going to touch much of the area that you don't want to look scuffed and damaged. And here I am using a knife again just to widen it up. Again, like I said, I want to disrupt that line so it's not a perfect line. I think that really adds to it looking a bit more old and vintage, but not all the way along, just in certain sections to add to sort of the idea that it's been banged and dented. And then I want that surface on the top to look like it's been used. And one way of doing that is using the sandpaper to sort of emulate the idea of a string turning and rubbing into the surface, scratching it up, roughing it up somehow. Sometimes that's not even that visible once you've got the strings on, but I like to have it there anyway. With a little bit of light there, you can see it a bit more obviously. I'll just show you very quickly how I'm working on the neck as well. I've seen on my source materials where the wear is that I want to copy from, and I'm kind of holding the sandpaper in between my hand, a bit like I'm playing. I'm focusing in on one area and going over it with the sandpaper until the wood is exposed. Now, this does take a little bit of time, but suddenly the wood can expose and that exposed bit can spread really quickly, so you need to keep an eye on what you're doing. What I would say is it's very tempting sometimes to go in with a thicker paper. I've started with 220 and then just work too hard. So you want to start maybe with something like 220 or 400 and then get finer and finer so you can go over, as I keep saying, to get rid of any scratches that might be visible on the neck. And that might also involve going up to 1000, using a bit of polishing or buffing compound to work on it. But you can see how it is very quickly exposed. I haven't actually sped this up so you can just see how quickly it happens. And that's where I'd go back in again with the wood stain or the watered down acrylic. But often I don't wash over the whole thing straight away, because if you've exposed the wood through the sealer, what you might find is that the stain covers too much of the area, and sometimes it's nice to have a bit dark and a bit light. You'll see that in my finished photos. And by the way, I'm leaving this as is once I've exposed it, but quite often I might then go back over with a clear coat, and that clear coat will seal everything in, including the sort of exposed bits and the cracks and the checking that you're about to see. I'll put a link in the video description to my other videos of relicing guitars, including where I've relicked the rest of this bass. And in some of those videos I talk about this next process I'm about to show you, where you cause the checking or the cracks on the finish of the guitar. Now, this bass has a natural nitro finish on it, and nitro cracks over time, and one way you can speed that up is by using a heat gun to heat up the surface, cooling it down rapidly with an aerosol can. I use the kind of air spray that you use to clean keyboards with. Having it upside down, just cold air comes out, a jet of cold air, and then I wipe off the sort of moisture that's left behind. Quite often you need to repeat this process over and over again to get the checking to appear. And some of this video is a bit out of sequence, so you might have seen some of the checking already on the back of the headstock where I'd use the heat gun and cooling process prior to starting this video. But to make those checks and cracks really stand out, I'm going over it again, using a wash. Again, I often use acrylic, sometimes I use wood stain, but I really quite like the watered down acrylic because you can really control the colour you want. I like a dark brown like this. And then you let it sit on the surface very briefly before wiping it down. You really want to wipe it down so it seeps into the cracks. What I notice is quite often you need to do this more than once in order to cause the checking and the cracks to really, really stand out and be emphasised how you like. But sometimes it's good to have a really subtle finish in some areas and darker in other areas. So again, having reference photos to work from is a really good suggestion here. So here we have the finished product. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and do check out the playlist that I'm going to link at the end and in the video description about the relic processes I go through, because I use lots of different techniques. It's not always the same, and there may be one that you prefer over another. Until next time, happy strumming.